In order to turn a beautiful bowl, you need the right tools and a little bit of experience, but sometimes it's just looking at a piece of wood and realizing, even though this may not look like much right now, there's hidden beauty inside. Please stay tuned to see what I did with this old dried out piece of wood. This week I started with an old cedar burl that I've had for a long time. I love working with cedar. Usually it has a few surprises inside, which you'll see here later. And this is a burl. Burls are, again, a beautiful piece of wood normally to work with. So for this, it was particularly dry, so I wanted to use a faceplate because a tenon would not hold it very well. So I did put in a faceplate with a lot of screws. Even though it's not very heavy, it is very light, it is very, very dry, so I didn't want it to shatter or break on me when mounted in the lathe. So here it is mounted in the lathe. You can see that it's a fairly odd shape. It's got a big lump here on the side, so it is turning a little bit out of balance. I have to go a bit slower, about 400 RPM, and it's going to bounce around until I get this a bit rounder. Also, because of the bark that's on this, and you can see large pieces coming off, I am wearing a face shield. Normally I just wear eye protection, but in this case, because of these larger pieces of bark, I am wearing a face shield. I don't often talk about it, but it's pretty obvious from this shot where my body position is. I am well forward of the piece of work. Now again, this is not a heavy piece. It's not likely to break off and anything go flying, but just in case, especially in the beginning when I'm starting to rough out a bowl, I want to stand in front of the piece because if anything were to fly off at this point, it's going to move to the left, away from me. And yes, I have had pieces come off the lathe. Here I'm just working the bottom of the bowl with what's going to be the tenon. You can also see here that the surface is still very rough. It's not cutting well. It's certainly not a finished cut. And the reason for that is because of the fact that it's out of round and the tool's bouncing around, it's hard to get a good surface, especially with this wood where it's so dry. So my focus at this point is to just get the bowl round, remove as much of that bark from the outside as possible, and then take a look at the shape and see what I have to work with. It may seem like I'm using a lot of tools here, switching back and forth. I'm really not. I do use my skew chisel here just to square up the bottom. You want to have a dovetail on this that matches your jaws in your chuck, so I do use that. But I also found that turning this bowl, the carbide tool seemed to work the best and give me the best surface. Now at this point I realize I'm not going to be keeping this bark, so I'm stopping every once in a while and picking out the larger pieces of bark that are already pretty loose. And then continuing to just to refine the shape of the outside of the bowl. Again, stopping frequently just to make sure I don't have any loose pieces. Watching the video here, and I do realize that I do have a bad habit. A lot of times when the bowl is spinning, I'll shut it off and I'll put my hand on it as it's slowing down. Especially on a piece like this that's so rough and got some non-continuous edges, this is not a good habit. So at this point, I'm done shaping the outside, so I'm just using my negative rake scraper to remove any tool marks and try and get as smooth a surface as I can. Now I have it flipped around. I still keep my faceplate mounted on, and that's inside my live center, just for additional support. Again, this piece is not heavy, but I am a little concerned that being as dry as this wood is, and being cedar, that the tenon could be a little brittle. So I want to give it as much support for as long as I can. Again, I tried using my bowl gouge, which would be my go-to tool when hollowing out the inside of a bowl. But for this piece, I did find that you can see the carbide tool is cutting well. You can see large shavings coming off. I am stopping once in a while just to check the bark inclusion inside the bowl, just to make sure everything is solid. At this point, I've removed the big faceplate that was on there, although I'm still keeping the tailstock engaged, again, just for additional support. Every once in a while, those pieces of bark inclusion that you see are catching my tool a little bit, but not too bad, and the surface with this tool is still fairly smooth. At this point, I'm starting to get down to the final thickness, so I'm stopping often to check the thickness. You can also see here that I do have a hole in the side of the bowl. So as you remember, the outside did have that burl surface, and as I go on the inside, some of those pieces are getting exposed, and here you can see those holes from the outside, which are also going to be part of the design of this bowl in the first place. As I remove those bark inclusions from inside the burl, I want to just smooth up the edges a little bit. So I use a combination of things. I use a chisel, I use a screwdriver just to pull those pieces of bark out. I use a sanding disc. Anything I can use really just to get inside where those pieces of bark are, because they're not going to stay. They're dry and they'll fall out. So I do want to remove them now and clean up the surfaces as much as possible. Now that I have that bark removed, it's ready to start sanding. I did find that this piece, being cedar, sands very easily. There wasn't much tear out, although the piece was very dry, and what little tear out there was, I was able to sand away quite easily. The only difficulty was because the surface is not smooth, I found that it sanded better with paper than it did with a power sander. I think it's just because it had a larger surface area than my normal 2-inch disc on my power sander. So that seemed to work well. The other thing is I turned it up as much as I could, the speed that is, so that my hand didn't bounce around quite so much. I know I just finished saying that I didn't do much power sanding, and I didn't. Only here on these smooth surfaces that you see was I able to use my power sander. And there was not a lot of those on the outside of this bowl. I tried to maintain as much height in the bowl as possible, but I did have some soft spots along the rim, so I did have to go back and remove those. Some of those were the pith, and they were just too punky to save, so I did end up cutting them down a little bit. Continuing to work on the bark inclusion removal, I did find that my Dremel tool worked quite well, along with a small pick, just to get inside those very small grooves. I did end up applying some sanding sealer to this. I did have some soft spots, so I wanted to stiffen those up. And I ended up using a brush. Normally I just wipe it on, but with this rough surface, I did want to use a brush so that I could get inside and seal those edges up well. But it's here, as I'm applying the sanding sealer, you can start to see the colors develop in the wood and see some of the beauty coming out. Now here I'm applying tung oil, which is a penetrating oil. So normally you wouldn't do that after applying sanding sealer, but off camera I did do some more sanding in between applying the sanding sealer and the tung oil. So I had no issue with the tung oil being absorbed into the wood. And here the tung oil just helps, again, bring out the colors in the wood that are there naturally and just emphasizes them and displays the beauty. This bowl turned out much better than I expected. It really has a lot of beauty inside of it. Here you can see some of the openings in the bowl. They were exposed due to the surface on the outside. And look at the markings in this burl. Beautiful, beautiful markings. The bowl turned out to be about 10 inches in diameter and 4 inches deep. Here again you can see the openings in the side of the bowl. Probably one of the prettiest bowls that I've done in a long time. It is a bit thicker than what I would have liked, but that I didn't have much choice on due to the roughness on the outside of the bowl, wanting to preserve that, and at the same time minimize the openings.